Michael Ironside is one of Hollywood's most unforgettable villainous faces. For decades, he appeared consistently in a long list of classic films, often portraying characters associated with violence, authority, and threat. Yet Michael Ironside was rarely placed among A-list stars, and almost never became the center of mainstream media attention. On screen, his face represented toughness and an unforgiving presence. But behind the camera, his personal life was marked by wounds that the public rarely speaks about. So what truly shaped the man behind that cold, unblinking stare? In this video, we begin to unravel that question. Michael Ironside was born in 1950 in Canada, into a family that never offered a lasting sense of safety. His childhood was not shaped by warm memories, but by repeated instability. His father struggled with alcoholism and often displayed violent behavior. Inside that home, tension was always present, not erupting all at once, but simmering quietly, long enough to teach a child to observe rather than speak. The family moved frequently, each place only temporary. There was never a space that lasted long enough to be called home, and no sense of safety ever truly took root. As he entered adolescence, Ironside faced another challenge, this time not from his family, but from his own body. He was diagnosed with thyroid cancer and underwent major surgery at a very young age. The operation saved his life, but left a permanent mark, damage to his voice, which became rough and deep, the very voice that would later become inseparable from his on-screen image. This was not an artistic decision, nor was it a deliberate choice. It was simply the cost of survival. From an early age, Ironside learned how to endure pain, and carried that endurance with him throughout his life and career. After reaching adulthood, Michael Ironside studied acting and began writing stage plays. He did not enter the industry with a clear plan to become a star. Instead, he wrote his own material, performed his own work, and appeared in small spaces, places where the stage was closer to the audience than the spotlight. His earliest roles were not breakthroughs. They were minor parts, supporting roles, often existing for only a few scenes. He was not chosen for mainstream appeal, nor was he shaped into a face meant to carry the box office. Over time, a pattern began to form in the roles he was offered. He was cast as characters who were harsh, uncomfortable, quiet, but heavy with pressure. Ironside did not resist this, nor did he attempt to soften his image to better suit the market. There was no effort at reinvention, no desire to escape roles that made others uneasy. He simply kept working, within the space where he was seen as fitting. Entering the 1980s, Michael Ironside moved into the most consistent and sustained working period of his career. He did not rise through sudden stardom, but gradually became a familiar name to major studios, particularly within science fiction and action films. In 1981, his role as the antagonist Daryl Revok in Scanners marked a decisive turning point. This was not a conventional villain role, but the central force of the film, a character through which Ironside could fully express coldness, violence, and psychological pressure head-on. The performance placed him firmly on Hollywood's map as a face capable of carrying the threat of an entire narrative. After Scanners, Ironside began appearing regularly in larger-scale projects. In 1986, he played Jester in Top Gun, not a leading role, but an essential presence within an ensemble that established the film's harsh military atmosphere, where emotion was tightly restrained. By 1990, he appeared again in Total Recall, this time as a powerful, cold, and ruthless figure standing directly against the story's central arc. Toward the end of the 1990s, Ironside became part of Starship Troopers, a now iconic work of militarized science fiction. By this stage, his image was unmistakable, an actor who needed no lengthy introduction, whose mere presence told the audience exactly what kind of force that character represented. For nearly 2 decades, Michael Ironside worked at a relentless pace. He did not carry the box office, but he remained a dependable choice for roles that demanded psychological weight. His name appeared consistently in major projects, not at the center, but in positions the films could not do without. He reached a different kind of peak, not the kind crowned by applause, but a presence Hollywood trusted. And yet, that very form of success also came with invisible limits. During the most stable period of his career, Michael Ironside was almost always placed in the same position within a story structure, not at the emotional center, but at the center of power. He played an authoritarian officer in Top Gun, where discipline was enforced through pressure and exclusion. In Starship Troopers, he embodied a militarized system, one where violence was justified by ideology. And in Total Recall, he stood as a cold, detached authority figure, willing to sacrifice human lives to preserve order. Viewed individually, each role made sense, but seen together, they formed a clear pattern. Ironside was repeatedly chosen to personify power. Not power that seeks affection, but power that demands obedience. What stands out is that the violence in these roles was rarely impulsive. It did not stem from personal rage or loss of control. It was sanctioned violence, wrapped in uniforms, ranks, commands, and ideals. Ironside's characters did not shout. They did not need emotional displays to assert dominance. They acted as if every decision had already been calculated, and human beings were merely variables that could be replaced. For this reason, his presence often felt colder than explosive. It was not fear of a brute. It was unease in the face of a system that does not care what you think. Hollywood seemed to understand this instinctively. When a face was needed to represent harsh order, authority that does not ask for permission, they turned to Ironside. Not because he shocked, but because he made violence appear reasonable. And this is where the pattern began to close in on itself. Ironside was trusted for his ability to embody organized power. But the more convincingly he did so, the more inseparable he became from it. Not as an acting choice, but as a presumed nature that required no explanation. From his own perspective, Ironside never saw himself as someone who glorified violence. He spoke openly about his hesitation toward scripts that used violence carelessly, without motivation or a clear power structure behind it. He accepted playing villains, but rejected characters that existed solely to shock. The repetition was never loud. It unfolded quietly, through scripts, through roles, through casting after casting, until that image was no longer just a performance, but the way the public perceived the man himself. And the label, the villain face, did not remain with the characters alone, but clung to the person standing behind the lights. To understand why those roles kept repeating, we have to go back further, to a time before Hollywood. Michael Ironside's childhood did not teach him how to negotiate with power. It taught him how to endure. Growing up in an unstable household, Ironside learned early that silence could be a form of self-defense. No public resistance, no direct confrontation, just observation, memory, and waiting for the right moment to keep going. When he entered the film industry, that pattern did not disappear. It simply changed settings. Ironside was never someone who negotiated his image easily. He did not try to make himself more palatable to others, nor did he reshape his personality to meet the system's expectations. Instead, he carried the same internal energy and let Hollywood decide how to use it. In an industry where flexibility is often treated as an advantage, that stance quietly became a limitation. Not because he lacked talent, but because he did not know or did not want to pretend to be someone else. The recurring roles of power and violence were therefore more than career choices. They reflected how Ironside existed in real life: emotional control, deliberate distance, and a refusal to expose vulnerability. There are people who are not good at compromise, not because they are arrogant, but because they never learned how to pretend. By the late 1990s, Michael Ironside's career did not come to an abrupt halt. It slowed. In the quiet way Hollywood often lets things fade. He was still working, still appearing. But the gaps between roles grew longer. Major projects and iconic villain roles gradually gave way to younger, newer faces, performers who were easier to reposition. Age began to show, and with it, an image that had become too familiar. Michael Ironside was no longer seen as an actor who could transform. He had become a template, reliable, but difficult to renew. In an industry always searching for what comes next, that consistency became both an asset and a limitation. At the same time, his health once again moved to the center of his life. Ironside faced cancer for a second time, not at an age filled with options, but after a body that had already endured decades of strain. Treatment, recovery, then treatment again. These cycles unfolded far from public view, without announcements or statements. He did not go to the media to explain. He did not tell his story. He did not seek sympathy. His absence came without a farewell, only a gradual withdrawal from places that had once been familiar. In Hollywood, silence is often misunderstood. It is easily read as failure or as being left behind. But in Ironside's case, it appears to have been a deeply personal choice. No more need to prove himself. No more need to maintain an image. Only a simple question remained: how to continue existing in the least damaging way possible. No declaration of retirement, no words of resentment. When Hollywood's spotlight was no longer the center of his life, Michael Ironside chose to remain connected to his work in a different way, quieter and closer to real life. He continued acting, but mostly in supporting roles on television, roles that did not carry the burden of leading the story. No need to make a strong impression, just appearing long enough to fulfill a very specific function within the script. These were often older characters, carrying experience, residual authority, or accumulated fatigue. Roles that did not demand the audience's admiration, only that they exist in the right place. At this stage, Ironside was no longer acting to prove anything. He acted because it was the craft he knew and one he still wanted to practice, as long as the pace allowed. Alongside television work, voice acting became a significant part of his creative life. As Sam Fisher in the Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell franchise, Ironside did not need to appear on camera. There was only the voice, restraint, and the familiar silences. Here, the voice once damaged by illness was no longer a trace of pain, but the central instrument. No image required, no spotlight needed. Only a presence steady enough to convince the listener that this character had lived long enough and seen enough. Outside of work, Ironside devoted most of his time to family. It was not a publicly announced choice, but a priority that unfolded naturally. After years spent in unstable environments, From childhood to film sets, family became the least volatile space he had. He rarely spoke about his private life. He shared no details. He did not recount the difficult years. Ironside's family existed outside the public narrative, and perhaps that distance allowed him to preserve a part of life untouched by image consumption. Life after the spotlight, for Michael Ironside, did not resemble retirement. It felt more like a contraction, a narrowing of focus where work continued but no longer dominated the entire self. A place where family, health, and privacy stood alongside career. No noise, no need for attention, just continuing to live. Close enough to real life that there was no longer a need to brace himself. Michael Ironside's return did not arrive with a clearly marked milestone. There was no film promoted as a comeback, no media moment reviving his name with nostalgic fanfare. He simply appeared occasionally, selectively, and exactly where he belonged. The roles he took on in this phase required little screen time, sometimes just a character who entered and exited, sometimes only a voice emerging from the dark. Yet for many viewers, that was enough to recognize him. Ironside no longer strained to become the familiar threat. He did not attempt to recreate the villainous image that once made others uneasy. The characters he chose carried less violence, less spectacle, but more weight of experience. These were people who had lived long enough to understand that power no longer needs to prove itself. The change did not come from the scripts. It came from the man himself. His gaze had grown deeper, slower, touched with fatigue, but not collapse. The look of someone no longer on the front line, yet fully aware of where he stands. What is striking is that Ironside did not need to appear often to be remembered. For a generation of viewers, he was never a name shouted aloud. He was a familiar feeling, an image tied to discipline, authority, and cold restraint, one that quietly shaped an entire archetype for decades without explanation. At this stage, his presence no longer sought to affirm anything. It functioned like a quiet punctuation mark, not ending the sentence, but forcing a pause. Ironside did not try to return to the center, nor did he need repeated mentions to prove he had once been there. He appeared only when it still made sense, and withdrew when it no longer did, not to reclaim the spotlight, just to exist, on his own terms. Michael Ironside never tried to step forward just to be seen more than necessary. He worked in silence, moved through roles defined by power and violence, and chose to step away when it felt like enough. There was no clear closing moment, no explanation offered. Just a man willing to stand outside the spotlight, to protect the part of life not consumed by attention. Perhaps what makes Michael Ironside memorable is not the number of roles he played, but the way he allowed himself to grow quiet in a world that constantly demands more visibility. And as this story comes to a close, it does not need a grand conclusion. It only leaves a pause, long enough for each of us to ask a very personal question. If it were you, would you dare to live at that pace? If this story made you stop for a moment, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories that are quiet but true, remember to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the end of the video. Goodbye, and see you in future videos.